Okay, enough with the dummy data. Why don't we start making our Ajax request so our pages start looking more dynamic? And by the way, we're going to start with our single page. So what we're going to do, even though in the list we have only three of them, we are going to get each and every recipe for this specific recipe in our single recipe page displayed. And why don't we have a look first of all, what would be their response? So I'm going to head over back again and I'm going to look at, okay, if I'm going to be looking for single recipe, first of all, how would I make that call? Well, I see that I'm going to be looking for food to fork, then I'm going to be looking for API, and then this is where my key comes in, and then I'm going to be looking for some kind of ID. In our case, this ID obviously is going to be dynamic, but for now, in order just to test it out, I can just set it up the new one again. I will going to copy and paste my API. So let's say like that. And this is not going to be React components because that is something that I do want to show you later on, though, because we're going to use the lifecycle methods in order to run our Ajax request. And once you see it here, that this is going to say forbidden. Okay, so I must have copy and pasted the wrong way. Let's again have a look what happens. Yeah, and that is, of course, because I included the API key. Let's just copy and paste it properly this time. And not the API key, but we can just maybe delete it. I think this is going to work exactly the same. Let's see how this is going to work. And this is going to be my response. And like I said, this is exactly the same like we have right now in our recipe details, where we have the publisher, the ingredients, the source URL, and so on and so forth. And now that we know this information, we can copy and paste it because we will going to destructure later on, meaning we're going to hide the key and do all that. And by the way, as a side note, if you are using GitHub after each and every video, don't rush after this video because I want to show you something in the next video. So don't push it up to the GitHub because there is a little bit of differences that I would like to make. And in this case, what we would want right now, just copy and paste this URL. And we're going to copy and paste it in our application. I'm going to head over back to my single recipe. We will going to head over up and we're going to create our lifecycle method. Now, what in the world is a lifecycle method and why we would want that? Well, in our case, we would want to run it when our component is going to mount already. And what are the lifecycle methods? If we're going to head over to a React component, remember as we were working with a functional classes or not functional classes, with functional components as well as the class-based components, I told you that there's two differences. One of them is the fact that class-based components, apart from the hooks, can have state. So the functional ones don't have the state. And then also the fact that we can have the lifecycle methods in the class-based components. That would be the difference. And what you're seeing right now is that the lifecycle methods are the methods that are going to be called when the component is being created and inserted into the DOM. So first one, we're going to have the constructor, then we have derived state from the props, then render, remember the render method, and then we also have the component did mount. And within this component did mount, we can make our Ajax request. And there's more lifecycle methods, and obviously you can do more research, but in my case, or in our case, we don't really care about the rest of them. What we care about a lot is component did mount. And I also would like to set it up right away as a async await. Because even though I could technically write it with a simple fetch, I think async await is just going to be a little bit better. So first and foremost, we're going to say async. Then the method is going to be component did mount. We're not going to pass anything within this actual method. However, once we are within the method, we can create our URL. Now, URL is going to be where we're going to be requesting the information from. And we already copy and pasted. Remember, we had this URL, and this is what we're going to be using. But like I said, in our case, we would want to make this dynamic because at this point, we're just getting all the time this ID with 35382. But we already know in a state what we're getting. Well, we're getting our specific ID in match params ID. And that is going to be specific for each and one of them, even though we're displaying right now the dummy data. So why don't we do this? We know already that we can access within the template literals the variables. So I'm going to say, okay, so I'm going to be looking for this dot state, and then we would want to get the ID that's going to be in a state. That's going to be our first step. Later on, we're also going to set up our try and catch. Now, try and catch is just going to be if there's going to be some kind of errors. And now let's set up our await. Since here we are using the async, we can use the await. And what await allows us to do is to write our actual structure that we're doing right now synchronously. Meaning we could technically do the fetch. And if you're aware of fetch, then what you do is, since you're returning the promise, then we would have some kind of URL, and then we would need to do dot then. Then again, we would do something with the information. One of the things is that we need to transfer it to be a JSON. So then we would say something JSON, then another then. And I think that with async await, it's just a little bit clearer what we're doing. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to say const response. That's going to be the variable that's going to be storing. And I'm going to write await. Again, I can just use that because I'm using that async await. That's the reason. If I'm using async, then I can just say await. And now what this is doing, it's saying, okay, so I'm going to be waiting for this information. And I'm going to set it up again, the fetch. This is going to fetch our Ajax request with this URL. And the URL obviously is dynamic since we're passing here the ID. Okay. Then let me show you what would happen of what kind of information we're going to be getting back, why we would want to have the JSON. So before we do anything, since we have the try and catch, why don't we also set up the error if there will going to be some kind of error? And let's just console log it. That should work. Console log, and for some reason I cannot get the log. And let's say if there's going to be error, we're going to console log it. And I would want to right away console log also my response. And you'll see that this is going to run because obviously this is the lifecycle method. Now this is going to run when the component has mounted, so did mount already. And then we're going to be requesting the dynamic information for that particular actually recipe. Now let me go back to all the recipes first. And then let's say for the hot potatoes. Now the moment I'm going to click on details, of course, this is going to open up the dummy data right now. But if we're going to go to the bigger screen, I think this is just going to show us a little bit better. So let's say again, we're going to maybe refresh. Let's say right here. And then let's do the inspect, since this should console log what we're getting back. And you notice we're having our response. And then within the response, we should be looking for not the body, not the status text or anything like that, but there should be somewhere JSON. So I'm going to say, okay, blob, blah, blah, blah. So this is that. Okay, that's not what we wanted. So text, and there it is. So we have the JSON. And that's the method we would want to call, because otherwise we're not going to be able to access that information. So we need to run the JSON, and then this is going to actually make it available. Otherwise, obviously, this is going to be string. So let's write that we're going to be looking for another method, not only response, but we also would want const response, and now say data. And now let's await again, since we're using async await. And this way we can do response JSON. That was the method. And again, the case was we could technically just write a fetch, but I thought that this is just going to make a little bit more clearer that we are writing this synchronously. So first we're running the fetch, then we're waiting when the JSON is going to be done, and then we're going to do something with our data. We could have written just with simple fetch with fetch dot then, and then obviously catch the error at the very end. And again, maybe let's do another console log. Let's use for response data. All right, let's head over back again. The moment again it's going to run, notice what you're going to get back. So this is going to be the recipe. And again, this is not going to match right now because this is going to be our dummy data. But within the object that we're getting back, we also have the recipe, and the recipe is going to be object. And now these are going to match exactly. Notice key value pair, key value pair, key value pair. The ingredients, of course, this is going to be an array, and so on and so forth. And then this is going to go obviously for this kind of ID. And okay, why don't we test it out? Why don't we go over here and let's say once we have our data, we will gonna run this dot set state. So I'm going to say this dot set state once the component has mounted. So did mount. We're going to write this dot set state, and now we're going to flip it around. We're not going to use the dummy data. However, I will going to comment this out just so you have something for a reference. And what I'm going to say is that the recipe is just going to be an empty object. That's it. Nothing else, nothing more. I also going to set it up that the loading is going to be true. So the moment we open up the single recipe page, loading is going to be running first, since loading is going to be true. But the moment we're going to set up this dot set state, I'm going to say, first of all, recipe is going to be equal to the object that I have in my response data. So response data, that's obviously not date, but data. And then we're going to be looking for that response, or I'm sorry, recipe that we have on the object. So I'm going to write recipe. First of all, we're going to set this equal. So not anymore the dummy data we're getting back from my file, but the data we're getting back from the foot to fork. And then let's set loading to false, because obviously I don't want that loading to be displayed all the time. And like I said, depending on how long this is going to take, meaning you saw that for a split second that we had it. But again, this is really going to depend how fast or slow your internet connection is. And you already can see the potato. So I know that everything's working. But let's say I'm going to go back to recipes list. If I'd want the coffee, again, this is going to be already dynamic. We did use the dummy data to get our original information, but now notice, click on it, and now I have the coffee. And again, we can head over to inspect if we want. We're obviously going to see in the console. I don't know. Nah. Obviously, we're not, because I already commented out. And then here it's complaining, well, recipe data is not used. Well, yeah, we're not using any more recipe data because this is something we just imported to build it. And yeah, congratulations. We have made our application dynamic. And what I would like to show you right now, though, is how we can set up the environment variables. So please don't push this up to the GitHub and listen to the next video. We're going to set up the environment variables. We're all going to be hiding our API key.